Well, hello there, and welcome to another Royal Holloway Geography for Schools lecture series. My name is Dr. Oli Mould. I'm a lecturer in human geography here in the department, and today what I'd like to talk to you about is gentrification and the global city. Two ideas perhaps which we may be very familiar with. They're often talked about in quite mainstream ways. But things that there are things which we may think we know a little bit about, but there's obviously a lot more to it. But first of all, what I'd like you to do is just have a look at this picture here, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and many of you might not be. This is, of course, the programme Downton Abbey. I'm not sure if any of you watch it. I watch it. It's quite a good programme. But really, if you think about what this programme is about, it's about class. There's a group of people who live the high life, if you like. They live in very luxurious, elite ways. And then they have their servants and their helpers, if you like, who live kind of on the lower ground floor. They live in their servants' quarters and they live elsewhere. And it's about the dynamics between those two groups of people. So really, it's a programme about class. And the reason I bring that up is because class is one of those really important ideas that has contributed to the idea of gentrification, or it's a foundational concept within the conceptualization, within the original thinkings of gentrification. That is because the actual term itself comes about through the writings of this woman here. Her name is Ruth Glass, and she wrote a book many years ago, in 1964, called London Aspects of Change, where she was looking at the ways in which London was changing in the post-war period, in the periods after World War II, as a lot of cities in the UK and even around the world were developing at quite rapid rates. The world was in a pretty dire straits after World War II. A lot of our cities needed to be rebuilt quite quickly to accommodate a growing population. And so London was like any other city. It was growing very quickly. Lots of change was happening. Lots of new buildings were going up. Lots of places were being built for people to live, to shop, to do what they needed to do. And in that process, in the 60s onwards, Ruth Glass was noticing that London, and specifically she was looking at North London here, quite a specific parts of the city. She was arguing that what was happening was that there was certain groups of people, i.e. the middle class, people with relatively large amounts of disposable income. They were going into traditionally working class parts of the city parts of the city that were occupied by often ethnic minorities, poorer people with perhaps less disposable income, people in rented accommodation, in social housing, for example. And they were going in and taking over that part of the city. They were buying out houses, buying out plots of land. And she related that to the process back in the 19th century, back in the early parts of the 20th century, thinking about what Downton Abbey does with the landed gentry. So that idea that there's a particular class of people back in the day where the landed gentry, they would come in and they would take over particular parts of the countryside. So that term gentrification, it comes from that word, the landed gentry. So that's where we get the term from. So Ruth Glass used that process which happened in the past to explain what she saw as going on in London in the 60s. So that's where we get the term gentrification from. So even from the actual original coinage of the term, class is embedded in everything we think about when it comes to gentrification. And so we can see some of that change here. This is the Leighton High Road in Waltham Forest, which is not massively dissimilar to the kinds of parts of London which Ruth Glass would have been talking about. This was some development which happened in part because of the Olympics. If you remember, the London 2012 Olympics was an extremely successful Olympics in many ways, not least for our gold medal haul, but also for the ways in which London, the city itself, had a lot of money poured into it to change it. And here we see some of those changes, the sort of traditional ways of thinking about how gentrification happens and how it looks, specifically how it looks. So you see it changes from relatively kind of old style, perhaps to use the term dilapidated, let's say, parts of London, and turns it into slightly more beautified, more upmarket, more sort of middle class consumption and retail outlets that you see there from the top to the bottom. So that's the kinds of processes that we're perhaps quite familiar with when it comes to thinking about gentrification. Then we have other people coming into the debate in the 80s and the 90s. One of the most important people was a guy called Neil Smith, who was a Scottish geographer but based over in New York. And what he looked specifically at New York, for the vast majority of his sort of research life, if you like. And his argument was that actually there was more to it. There's more to gentrification in places like New York and London, in these global cities. There was more to it than simply just people going in and buying up houses and just changing the kind of social demographics, the class demographics of the area. And he argued this. He said that the crucial point about gentrification is that it involves not only this social change, but also, at the neighbourhood scale, a physical change in the housing stock, and crucially, an economic change in the land and the housing markets. And so he says that it's this combination of the social, physical, and economic change that distinguishes gentrification as an identifiable process or a set of processes. So he was arguing that beyond simply a sort of social issue, it includes a physical change, it includes a sort of way that the housing looks, as we saw in that previous photo there, but also how it changed economically as well. So actually his argument was, and based on his research, as I say, in New York and many other parts of the world, is that gentrification includes a lot of different kinds of ways of understanding the world, social, physical, and economic. And we could throw into the mix cultural, political, and all sorts of different ways in which gentrification has manifested over the last few decades, really. So Neil Smith was crucial in really trying to kind of take that argument forward. And one of the mechanisms by which he tried to explain this was the rent gap theory. And so back in the 80s, he was doing a lot of work regarding this idea of the rent gap theory. Now, without going into too much detail, because he used a lot of graphs and a lot of statistical and financial information about how much rent was over periods of time and everything, and that's not necessarily that important right now. At its basic idea, the rent gap theory is that the difference, or the largest gap between what the land is worth as it currently is and what it could be worth if it was developed to its to the full extent it could be. And so there's an image here that you kind of get the idea where there's like a brownfield site in the middle of a city, or an abandoned shop, or even these days things like social housing estates where people actually live. You can see that these places often they are surrounded by areas of perhaps more upmarket retail shops, perhaps more upmarket housing, and you can just tell, you can just go to these places and you can say, well, that's going to be developed soon. Even without knowing who owns it and the processes around it, you can tell, well, actually, there's a bit of a rent gap here because this place is going to be developed. If you take that brownfield site and it's surrounded by other brownfield sites, you can say, well, actually, there's not much of a rent gap here because if you were to build on this site, you wouldn't really be contributing much to the site. So the rent gap is that sort of distance, if you like. And, you can measure that financially, but sometimes you can just feel it. You can just tell when you walk around the city and see these kinds of places. So this idea of the rent gap is a crucial part of how we can identify, analyse, and just sort of pinpoint where gentrification might happen and how it has happened. So gentrification has been a really important part of how we think about urban development. I've talked a little bit there about the issues of class and the rent gap theory and all the other different ways in which people have thought about how it happens. But one of the other terms that is crucial to understanding it, this idea of the global city. Now, what we'll end up sort of talking about is how the two are related. But the idea of the global city, which obviously includes gentrification as a sort of developmental practice, but the idea itself has its own history. And really, it was coined by this woman here, Professor Saskia Sasan, an American urban sociologist, really, again working in New York. And she wrote this book in 1991, but there's previous work beforehand by many other people, really, as well. But her work was suggesting that actually if you look around the world today, there are a handful of cities that command and control economic globalization specifically. And the very title of her book is called The Global City, New York, London and Tokyo. So she argues that back in 1991, that there were these three cities in strategic parts of the world, say Asia, Europe and America. These were the key global cities that actually contained within them the switches, if you like, and the nodes of how economic globalization happened. So, for example, you might have the headquarters of a bank in London. There are lots of headquarters of banks in Canary Wharf, in Wall Street, in Marunouchi, which is the sort of financial district of Tokyo. And in these banks, in the sort of headquarters, in the meeting rooms, in the conference rooms that overlook the city, they will make decisions about where people are based and where banks are to open up. I've got many of my friends who work in these parts of the world, and they are told within a few months' notice to say, right, your job is now being moved to Dubai, or we are now going to open an office in Shanghai or Sydney, and we want you to go over there and help set it up. And these things go on all the time. And these decisions are made in these global cities. And it's about where mines have opened up to, dig coal and gold out of the ground, where a factory might open up, where a new giga battery place Tesla might open up. And so the arguments for a global city are that those decisions are made in key control centres of the world, and often very hyperlocal places like Canary Wharf. It's not just London, it's just Canary Wharf. And so the argument being is that these cities are incredibly important nodes in the broader economic globalization of the world. So they make key decisions about where economic activity happens, how the geography of the world's economic production comes about, and these decisions are made, and they compete with one another. So London is competing with New York, is competing with Tokyo, is competing with Shanghai and everywhere else to try and attract these companies and these peoples into those key decision-making processes, because that's where the money is made, essentially. And so it's part of that kind of broader shift that we saw in the 80s and 90s, which is the response to globalization. This idea that the global trade was becoming more weightless. That's the term that often gets bandied around, although to say that it's weightless is a bit of a misnomer, because clearly it's still based on very much material aspects. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the weightless economy or the internet has no material stuff to it. It very much does. However, it's at around that time, the 80s and 90s, the massive globalization of economic activity. Airline travel was increasing. The internet was taking off. There were new technologies in how we can move goods around the world, and so there was a great political shift in response to this economic activity. And so national governments, the UK government, the US government, but also many other governments around the world, they began to implement policies which favoured the capture of this trade, that favoured the globalisation of their urban environments, insofar as Canary Wharf itself was a political decision to try and increase the capacity of London's ability to control the world economy. So there were lots of political decisions made in order to try and harness the profitability, if you like, of this new globalized world. And so Canary Wharf itself, but also Wall Street and these other areas, these come about through economic and political decisions made to try and become the leader in economic globalization. And what it meant was there was a sort of shift in these cities in the way that they were governed, to become more like companies, to become more business-like, to become more entrepreneurial. And so they competed with one another. And so we see cities as brands, we see cities as companies now, branding themselves in much the same way that Tesla would, or Nike, or Adidas, or whatever it might be. So cities, this shift to this sort of entrepreneurialization of cities brings about this kind of this global city phenomena, and hence you can see how it includes gentrification within it, and how gentrification marries up with this idea of the global city. Because the landscape of London, the landscape of New York, the landscape of all these other kind of global cities becomes a kind of hinterland. They become geared towards helping London compete with New York to become global, to become the kind of command and control centre. And obviously all the political will, all the councils in London, or all the kind of, the businesses or the people that are involved in London, they all work towards trying to create London, or whichever city it might be, to be more global. And so we see the redevelopment of housing, for example, to become more akin to what professional people might want, people who work in these big companies, the kind of housing that they might want to live in, the kinds of shops that they might want to buy, to shop in, the kinds of restaurants they might want to eat in. And so this global city phenomenon is kind of turbocharging this idea of gentrification. So you can see already how there are political and global factors at play in the gentrification of the city. And clearly what happens is, if you think about the rent gap, there are parts of London, big parts of London, which, if you think about it from a city's perspective, become sites of redevelopment. They become almost brownfield sites in and of themselves, even though there might be people living there might be shops there already. And a classic example, almost a sort of patient zero, if you like, of a lot of gentrification studies, particularly in the last sort of decade or so, has been the Elephant and Castle area of London, specifically the Haygate Estate, which was this is what it used to look like. The Haygate Estate in London was a sort of 70s, I think 1974 it was built. I think it was a social housing estate in South London in Zone 1. This is what it used to look like prior to demolition, and this is what it now looks like. These are sort of artists' renderings. You can go there and have a look around. It's pretty much finished. It was sort of finished, I think, a couple of years ago now. But if you think about the difference, so let's just go back and have a look at those. If you look at the difference between these two, clearly there's a physical difference insofar as that one looks traditionally kind of old school modernist and the sort of brutalist style which people don't seem to like anymore, and this is more in keeping with the trends and the sort of global city look which everyone's really trying to get at the moment. But really it became a symbol of London's housing crisis. It became a kind of, like I say, a sort of patient zero. A lot of people studied it, a lot of people looked at it, and it happened at a time sort of just in the sort of turn of the century, 2005 to sort of 2010, where a lot of these policies are really coming to the fore. So the Haygate Estate was home to over 1,000 social flats. It housed nearly 3,000 people, and this new development cost somewhere between, I think, 1.2 and 1.5 billion. Some of the figures that I've seen, but it has just only 72 social flats. So a lot of the arguments are that, well, you can see this gentrification happening, but it has a fundamental impact on the kinds of people that live there. So a lot of those people who lived in the social housing, the urban poor, ethnic minorities, people who couldn't afford to live anywhere else in the city, now found themselves with nowhere to go. And indeed, one of the buildings, number 1, the Elephant, which is this sort of massive skyscraper, has zero kind of affordable housing in it, which is this term which is banded around to just to offer to people to say, well, it's affordable housing, but it's not really that affordable at all. And these are due to particular policies, for example, Section 106, which is a policy that says any new development must include a social good, be that social housing, be that something that the community can use. It might be a swimming pool or a gym or some sort of a garden or something like that. But what happens is that often developers will use the Section 106 loopholes to just build more luxury flats because they know that they'll sell more. So essentially what we see in the Haygate Estate is a microcosm of what's happening around the world, with how politics and economics have kind of cross-cut, if you like, with the social dynamics of the area to create large-scale gentrification process, which is a much broader pattern of process than simply the middle class going in and developing, working class areas. You've got large-scale companies and politicians all swooping down and saying this is what needs to happen in order for it to become a global city. But the fundamentals of the process are kind of the same. There's always that class-based element to it. And so what happens with the people, what this has tangible on-the-ground effects are the people that live there. Southwark Council are the London borough that own, or the kind of where the Haygate Estate was in, and they kind of decanted these existing tenants around London. And so this is some work which Loretta Lees, who's a geographer based at Leicester University, does a lot of work on this. She mapped where these people have gone, and as you can see there, they've gone as far as Rochester and Kent and Thurrock and Slough. Now, if they've been offered another home, they've been offered another home, that's good. But the thing is, if you're moving out of an area when, if you consider that maybe your local GP might still be there, your mental health services, your kid's school, your church, whatever it might be, there is a community that you've built around, and suddenly you're told you have to move. This has real on-the-ground consequences, often negative for these groups of people. And so these people that have been moved will largely have been people who, considered part of the urban poor or the working class. And so there's a lot of these kinds of detrimental effects within the gentrification in global cities like London and New York, as well as the positive benefits as well. So we see things like historic buildings being demolished, and in the age of climate change, demolishing buildings is actually a far more carbon-heavy activity than just simply refurbishing them. So there's been a big drive at the moment to stop demolitions, actually, to refurbish them, because it's far more environmentally friendly. But these large-scale gentrification projects that sort of are initiated because of the desire to become a global city. We see huge tracts of land and housings that are demolished. And actually what it does is it pushes up the rents, it makes places unaffordable, it creates more homelessness, and we see the problems that many of us are very familiar with in these cities of, unaffordable housing, rents are too high, homelessness is on the rise, it's up sort of 10 times since 2010. And this is a direct consequence of this gentrification process, which is a direct consequence of the political, economic and social processes that I've just described. And so, because of this desire to make a city global, gentrification, it becomes part of that process. So what Neil Smith argued is that it said globalization of productive capital embraces gentrification. In other words, that desire to become a global city and the financial rewards that it reaps has to gentrify. They have to kind of embrace this idea of gentrification. But that's not the whole story. I just want to touch on the fact that clearly there's lots of other processes going on that try to resist this. There's lots of anti-gentrification groups that are largely come about through affected residents. On the top right here, we see a group of single mothers called the Focus E15 mothers, who were decanted, if that's the right word, from somewhere in Newham post the Olympics, but they got together and they created a sort of resistance group and managed to fight for their homes. And we see these things happening all over the world. We see anti-gentrification camps, we see protests, sit-ins, and we're all very familiar with protest these days, but they come from a desire to resist some of the what they see as the problems of that kind of broader gentrification process. And there's a whole set of literatures on that. There's a whole set of things that we could that I guess if you do geography at Royal Holloway, you'll learn about as you go through the course. So just to sum up, really, gentrification, as we've discussed, really has come a long way in the sort of 50 years or so plus that from when Ruth Glass first defined it in 1964. It's become less about the kind of small-scale changes in urban neighbourhoods, although that's clearly still very important, but it's become more about an ingrained process in the global city development idea. And actually, we see huge amounts of critique. There's libraries full of books and papers and newspaper articles, and I think even gentrification was mentioned on EastEnders once as well. So it's a very, very big and growing topic, and it's far too big for any one person to keep on top of. And it continues to sort of grow. We've got things like planetary gentrification now, which Loretta Lees has talked about. We've got the planetary rent gaps and other things like that. So there's lots of really interesting ways to take it, lots of fantastically sort of nuanced ways and critical ways and meta ways to think about gentrification in the global city. But the takeaway point is that gentrification really has become part of the wider process of urbanisation.